This is really a focus of Russian attack efforts, and the sky this morning has been riven by airstrikes, the sound of explosions perpetually in the distance. You can hear the war very close. And speaking to people here, they have no sense at all that despite the spasm of recent diplomatic initiatives, the meeting between Presidents Trump and Putin, and then the meetings between Trump and European leaders and their President Zelensky here, that the war is any nearer to ending at all.
Now, as Ukraine marks Independence Day today, 34 years since the country left the Soviet Union, Ukrainian flags will appear above Downing Street and several Whitehall buildings. The Times' special correspondent Anthony Loyd has been reporting from the Donbass, where Russian strikes have been relentless. Good morning, Anthony.
Good morning.
Thanks so much for speaking to us this morning, Anthony. Now, as the country commemorates Independence Day from the Soviet Union today, as I just said, 34 years since the country left the Soviet Union. What are people telling you on the ground when you talk to them about the prospect for a peace deal now?
There's deep suspicion at the prospect of any peace coming anytime soon. So I'm in Kramatorsk, and this is one of the major cities in the 22% of the Donbass region, which Ukrainian forces are still defending. So this is really a focus of Russian attack efforts, and the sky this morning has been riven by airstrikes, the sound of explosions perpetually in the distance. You can hear the war very close. And speaking to people here, they have no sense at all that despite the spasm of recent diplomatic initiatives, the meeting between Presidents Trump and Putin, and then the meetings between Trump and European leaders and their President Zelensky here, that the war is any nearer to ending at all. They say it's all people I've spoken to feel it's a charade. They feel hurt that Ukraine is being asked to make concessions when Ukraine was invaded, when Ukraine didn't start the war. But more to the point, they don't feel any momentum towards a lasting peace at all. They say the war is a daily entity in their lives, and they see no end to it. They also feel they have no real choice in it either.
I mean, Anthony, this time last week on Sunday morning, we were still sort of trying to decipher what the Alaska summit would lead to. I mean, is the answer now, does it feel like absolutely nothing? I mean, Sergei Lavrov seems to think so. Was it little more than a PR stunt, really, by Putin?
I think Putin certainly got what he wanted out of it. It made him look like he was back on the world stage. You know, the red carpet was rolled out for him. He shook hands with, the leader of the free world, the president of the United States. There was also a sense that, hey, just maybe, because, Trump is a disruptor and sometimes that can work, just maybe there might be a chance that the subsequent process would get enough momentum to lead somewhere. But then by the time you had the meeting in Washington between Trump and the European leaders and President Zelensky, if you really looked at what was agreed there, nothing was agreed, really. It was deemed a success merely because Trump hadn't gone, completely loco and full Putin. He hadn't humiliated again the Ukrainian leader. He hadn't gone into one. But actually, there was kind of vague discussions of American support potentially for security guarantees. There was vague discussion of an Article 5 type security guarantee for Ukraine. But I think a lot of people misinterpreted that. The Article 5, which was sort of discussed in the most nebulous way, was similar to that in the Istanbul Memorandum of 2022 in April, when there was talk about ways perhaps of ending the Ukrainian conflict then. And that was the security guarantee, not of an all-for-one military response if Ukraine was further attacked, but of a kind of discussion between different guarantors, including Russia and China, as to what would happen in the event of future hostilities. The talk has never really progressed beyond that Washington meeting ever since. And now with Lavrov's remarks, it seems that even the meeting between Putin and Zelensky may never happen at all. So really, it does all seem a bit of a charade, or certainly to have led to nothing concrete at all. The war seems as in free fall as much now as it did 10 days ago.
Yeah. Anthony, you mentioned that you're in Kramatorsk and your dispatch from there a couple of days ago was incredibly moving. Tell us about Galina, who is a mother who's still looking for her daughter.
So first of all, starting with the city itself, Kramatorsk is the city. It's in very much at the forefront of the war, and has been subjected to occasional attack over the last couple of years. And in one memorial instance, 63 people were killed by a Russian missile at the train station. In recent weeks, however, the violence has got worse, and you've got more and more Russian airstrikes, usually by glide bombs, which bombs are released some distance away and then they glide in with a motor to direct them onto the target. Some of those bombs have been happening in the city centre, some of them on the outskirts of the city, as well as drone attacks too. Well, 3 weeks ago, two big apartment buildings, 5-story buildings, were hit by a glide bomb right in the centre of the city, and 7 people were killed, a total of 7. They found 6 bodies and then another. Missing in that blast was a young 20-year-old woman called Yelena. By chance, I was at the site of that bomb strike now, which is still a burnt-out building standing there, when Yelena's mother, Galina, walked up with a small posy of daisies and put them on the rubble. So I got into conversation with her, and she said that her daughter had died in the rubble and she'd waited for 4 days waiting for rescue workers to try and find and locate her daughter's body, which they eventually did. And as she was speaking to me, the air raid siren started again, and then in no time afterwards, this huge salvo of Russian glide bombs and drones started hitting the ridgeline just away to our north, and clearly visible. The impact on local people who are standing around that site of wreckage, which had only been bombed 3 weeks earlier, was obvious and immediate and very physical. People were literally jumping, not with the shock of the concussion blasts which were rolling around the city, but with the trauma of what they'd already experienced, and then they were worried was going to happen again. So I was speaking with this grief-stricken woman who had lost her daughter to rubble of a Russian strike 3 weeks ago, at the same time as more Russian strikes were occurring. And it was just, a woman trying to deal with her own intense grief. She's described it as so heavy that she found it difficult to breathe in the midst of an ongoing war. Here, a world away from the meetings of diplomats and presidents in Alaska and Washington, it just seemed otherworldly. The comparison, it couldn't be more different and more brutal in contrast.
Yeah, the real Frontline, absolutely. Anthony, you've also interviewed a very different character, a Ukrainian street fighter who is now a very popular military sort of blogger and YouTuber. He's a really extraordinary story. Who is he, and why has he got such an enormous following?
Serhiy Stanenko. So Serhiy is 30 years old, and he's many things. He's a social influencer. He's Ukraine's leading military blogger. He's a YouTuber, and he's a drone supplier. He's raised, since the full-scale invasion began, nearly 5 billion hryvnias into supplying drones, and over 216,000 FPV drones. These are the small kamikaze drones which kill more soldiers than any other weapon type on the front line. Now, he's extremely outspoken, also a very controversial figure. He was involved in the Ukrainian revolution, actually, of 2014, right from the start, the revolution of dignity. He was there on Maidan Square in those seismic protests right at the beginning of it all that overthrew, finally, the pro-Kremlin president, Yanukovych. Then he was present in more street protests in Odessa, which resulted in a fire, very controversial fire, in which 42 pro-Russians died in 2014. At that time, Stanenko was the regional head of the Right Sector, which was an umbrella group of rightist organizations and some extreme right organizations as well. So he's not without controversy, loathed by the Russians, who say he's an ultra-nationalist. Now, I spoke to Stanenko a lot. He's very, very influential figure amongst a younger generation of Ukrainians, not just because of his sentiments against the Russian invasion of his country, but also of his challenges to corrupt elements of local government. And that's a really big deal in Ukraine. I think often we tend to see what happens here from outside in a binary way of Ukraine and Zelensky versus the Russian invaders. But actually, politically, there's a lot of division internally here with the younger generation of Ukrainians angry at some of the corruption and ineptitude in government. Now, Stanenko's spoken out about this consistently, really since 2014. He survived 4 different assassination attempts, some of those at the hands perhaps of local enemies who he's amongst corrupt authorities or pro-Russian authorities that still exist or did exist in Odessa, and others certainly backed by the Russian State Security Service or Federal Security Service, the FSB. Most recently, on the 1st of May, he was shot in the leg by an attacker, a woman who was waiting for him outside his doorway. She's subsequently been arrested. But before then, in 2018, he was involved in a very controversial attack when 2 men attacked him outside his apartment at night. He killed one of the men while fighting them off and then was pursued by a court case for years. All charges were eventually dropped. So this is a very influential figure and a very controversial figure, but someone who has a voice that is very, very popular amongst the younger generation of Ukrainians for his outspoken views which challenge authority, both sides of the line.
Yeah, and also knows how to communicate with them. Elsewhere, Anthony, there's been a renewed push to allow journalists into Gaza, which I know is a campaign you've been involved in. The UK is among 27 countries demanding that Israel immediately give international journalists access and to allow them to cover this humanitarian crisis. Obviously, Israel thinks it's not in their best interest to do that.
Obviously, Israel considers it's not in their best interest to do that. Here's the thing, the golden rule of effective reporting, surmised by 2 words, be there. People have a lot more credibility in a journalist report if they are reporting from the ground with their own work and their own eyewitness reportage. When a journalist is removed or blocked from going somewhere, then the narrative becomes far easier to manipulate for those outside, or far easier to cast aspersion or suspicion over. So it's not that, I'm not saying this with some sort of colonialist sentiment that, if British journalists are in Gaza, it would make a whole lot of difference, more than our reports would carry more weight than those of our Palestinian colleagues there. What I am saying is that so long as the reporting is just done by our Palestinian colleagues there, it makes it far easier, should I say, for the Israeli government to to smear the reports of Palestinian journalists, saying, they're just partisan because they're Palestinians. Or the reports alternatively trickle out in the absence of a mainstream media there through social media. And again, that social media, no one's sure quite what to believe or what not. So control of the narrative becomes far easier when in the absence of international journalists in Gaza. That is why it is so important for international correspondents to be given access. Their access would not change the whole course of the war, but it would lead to a lot of people, millions of people across the world, having a clearer vision of what they could believe was going on inside Gaza. And that's why it's so important. So it's great news that Britain is one of 27 countries which has supported a statement by the Media Freedom Coalition demanding access on the back of a Freedom to Report campaign of which I was a part, which has already attracted the signatures of more than 2,000 leading journalists across Britain and Europe. Whether or not Israel will heed any of these calls for access remains to be seen. I doubt it.
Thank you so much for your time this morning, Anthony. We so appreciate it. It's always brilliant to speak to you. That is, of course, the great Anthony Loyd, whose work you can read in the Times pretty much every day at the moment and online with a digital subscription.